At some point in your life, you may notice something strange happening in a friendship that once felt completely natural. The two of you are sitting together, talking like you always have. The conversation moves in familiar directions. The same topics appear again. The same stories return. And yet, internally, something feels slightly different. You listen. You respond. From the outside, nothing seems unusual. But somewhere in the background of your awareness, a quiet thought appears. Why does this feel different now? Nothing bad happened between you. There was no conflict, no betrayal, no moment where the friendship clearly changed. And because nothing dramatic occurred, the mind struggles to understand what you're feeling. These are people who have shared parts of your life. People who once felt completely aligned with the person you were becoming. But personal growth rarely moves in perfect synchrony. Sometimes one person starts to change internally, long before that shift becomes visible in the relationship itself. Carl Jung observed that psychological development often brings subtle shifts in how we experience the world around us, not only in our ambitions or beliefs, but in the quiet dynamics of everyday relationships. And one of the most unexpected places where this shift appears is in friendship. Because sometimes, as the inner self evolves, something delicate begins to happen. Certain friendships don't end. They simply begin to feel quieter. One of the quiet realities of personal growth is that it rarely happens at the same time for everyone. You see it if you're in the Sophia stage. Two people may share years of friendship. They may have gone through important moments of life together, supported each other during difficult periods, celebrated the same victories, and navigated the same disappointments. For a long time, it can feel as if both lives are unfolding along the same path. But inner change rarely follows a shared timeline. Sometimes one person begins to evolve internally while the other continues, living within patterns that once felt familiar to both of you. This kind of change does not arrive dramatically. It usually begins with small shifts in attention. Things that once felt exciting begin to feel less important. Conversations that once pulled you in now feel slightly repetitive. Topics that once created curiosity now feel strangely distant, as if they belong to an earlier chapter of life. What makes this moment confusing is that the other person may not have changed at all. They may still be the same friend you have always known. Still kind. Still familiar. Still connected to the history you share. And yet, something in the interaction begins to feel different. Not wrong. Just slightly out of rhythm. This is often one of the first signs that two inner journeys are beginning to move at different speeds. One person is still standing comfortably inside a familiar way of seeing the world, while the other has quietly started to look at life through a slightly different lens. When this happens, the friendship itself may not disappear, but the invisible timing that once made everything feel effortless begins to loosen. And little by little, the connection that once felt perfectly aligned begins to feel like it belongs to a different stage of life. Another reason friendships sometimes begin to feel different during periods of inner growth has less to do with the other person, and more to do with the role you once played in the relationship. Every friendship, over time, develops a kind of invisible balance. Not a balance that anyone consciously plans, but a subtle structure that forms through repeated interactions. One friend becomes the storyteller. Another becomes the organizer. Someone else becomes the one who brings humor into tense situations. And very often, there is also the friend who listens, the one who absorbs emotions easily, the one others instinctively turn to when something feels heavy or confusing. Many people who later identify with the idea of being an empath recognize themselves in this role. They were often the person who could sense what others were feeling before it was even spoken aloud. The friend who offered comfort. The one who could sit with someone else's struggles for hours, trying to understand, soothe, or make sense of things. For a long time, This role can feel natural, even meaningful. Being emotionally attuned to others creates a powerful sense of connection. But personal growth gradually changes the way emotional energy moves inside a person. As people begin to understand themselves more deeply, something subtle begins to shift. Empathy remains. The ability to understand others does not disappear. But the automatic habit of carrying everyone else's emotional weight begins to fade. You may still listen, still care, still feel compassion for the people in your life. But the instinct to absorb every problem, every frustration, every emotional storm begins to soften. And this change can alter the structure of certain friendships in ways that are difficult to explain. Because some relationships were quietly built around the emotional role you once played. The one who always understood. The one who always held space. The one who could carry the invisible emotional tension of the group without ever asking for anything in return. When that role begins to change, the dynamic of the friendship often changes with it. Not because the bond was false, and not because anyone intended to take advantage, but because the balance that once held the relationship together is slowly reorganizing itself. And in that moment, many people notice something surprising. Some friendships feel different not because the other person has changed, but because the version of you that the friendship was built around is no longer exactly the same. Many of these changes in relationships can feel confusing while they are happening, because from the outside, nothing obvious explains them. But more than a century ago, the psychologist Carl Jung observed something important about the way human beings grow internally. He believed that much of our early identity is shaped by the expectations of the world around us. Family expectations, cultural norms, the emotional patterns of the people we grow up with. Without realizing it, we learn to adapt ourselves to these environments. We become the reliable friend, the agreeable person, the one who keeps the peace, or sometimes the one who carries emotional responsibility for everyone else. This process helps us belong. It allows relationships and communities to function. But Jung believed that at a certain stage of life, something deeper begins to unfold within the psyche, a process he called individuation. Individuation is not about rejecting other people. It is about gradually discovering the part of yourself that exists beneath the roles you learn to play. Jung often described this deeper center of the psyche as the inner self. You can think of the inner self as something like the quiet center of a wheel. When we are younger, our attention is often focused on the outer rim, the places where the wheel touches the world. That rim is made of our roles: friend, partner, employee, caretaker, the person who keeps everyone emotionally stable. These roles are not fake. They are real parts of life, but they are not the center. As individuation unfolds, attention slowly begins to move away from the outer rim of the wheel and toward the center, toward the place where your own values, perceptions, and instincts begin to organize themselves more clearly. This movement toward the center is what Jung called differentiation. Differentiation simply means the psyche becomes more distinct, less shaped by external expectations, more guided by its own inner orientation. You may notice this shift in surprisingly ordinary moments. Perhaps you are in a conversation where everyone is reacting emotionally to a situation. In the past, you might have immediately felt pulled into the same emotional current, trying to analyze it, trying to solve it, trying to emotionally stabilize the situation. But now something different happens. You still understand what people are feeling, but instead of being pulled outward by the intensity of the moment, your attention remains more anchored inside yourself. You observe, you listen, and before reacting, you notice a quiet internal question forming. What actually feels true to me here? This small pause, almost invisible to others, is often one of the first signs that the center of the psyche has begun to reorganize itself. And when this happens, something subtle begins to shift in relationships. Because many friendships were formed when two people were still meeting each other primarily at the outer rim of the wheel. Through shared roles, shared habits, shared emotional patterns. But when one person begins to move closer to their psychological center, the place from which they experience life begins to change. The way they interpret conversations changes. The way they respond to emotional dynamics changes. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the invisible balance that once held certain relationships together begins to reorganize itself. Sometimes this deepens the connection. Sometimes it transforms it. And sometimes, very quietly, it creates a growing distance between the life you are living now and the emotional world where the friendship once began. When this process of inner differentiation begins to unfold, the changes rarely remain confined to the inner world. Over time, they begin to influence the way we experience the people around us, not because we suddenly reject others, and not because the past connections in our lives lose their meaning, but because relationships are always shaped by the psychological place from which two people meet each other. When that place changes within one person, the relationship itself can begin to feel slightly different. This is often when another realization begins to emerge. Some friendships were formed around a version of you that existed earlier in your life. Not because that earlier version of you was false, but because identity naturally evolves over time. At different stages of life, different aspects of our personality become more active. There may have been a time when certain friendships felt perfectly aligned with who you were becoming. You shared the same concerns, the same frustrations, the same ways of interpreting the world around you. Conversations flowed easily because both people were responding to life through a similar emotional lens. In many ways, the friendship reflected the psychological environment of that period of life. But when inner development begins to shift your attention inward, something subtle starts to change. Your priorities begin to reorganize. Certain concerns that once occupied your mind no longer feel as central. Certain emotional dynamics that once felt familiar begin to feel slightly distant. Not wrong, just less compelling than they once were. And this is often the moment when a person begins to notice a quiet difference while spending time with an old friend. You may still appreciate the person, still respect the history you share, but the interaction itself no longer feels quite the same. The conversations move in familiar directions, yet your internal response to those conversations has shifted. Topics that once felt engaging now feel like echoes from an earlier chapter of your life. This does not mean the friendship lacked authenticity. Most friendships are deeply real within the context of the stage of life in which they formed. But relationships are also shaped by the identities of the people participating in them. And when one of those identities begins to evolve, the dynamic of the relationship naturally begins to adjust. Sometimes both people grow in ways that allow the friendship to deepen, but other times, the emotional landscape that once supported the relationship no longer exists in quite the same way. And this realization can create a surprisingly complex emotional response. Because recognizing that a friendship belongs to an earlier chapter of your life does not erase the care you still feel for that person. If anything, it can make the situation more difficult to understand. Because nothing has been broken. There has been no conflict. No clear event that explains the shift. Yet the connection that once felt completely natural now carries a quiet sense that something has changed beneath the surface. And when people begin to recognize this change, another feeling often emerges alongside it. Not distance, not indifference, but something far more complicated, a complicated kind of guilt. The kind that is difficult to explain even to yourself. Because you may still care deeply about the people in your life. You may still appreciate everything those friendships once meant to you. The memories are real. The laughter was real. The support you gave each other during difficult moments was real as well. And yet, Despite all of that, something inside you has changed. The connection no longer moves with the same ease it once did. This is often the moment when people begin to question themselves. Am I becoming distant? Am I abandoning people who were important to me? Have I somehow become less caring than I used to be? These questions can feel heavy because empathy does not disappear during psychological growth. If anything, it often becomes deeper and more conscious. But empathy does not mean remaining frozen in the same emotional role forever. For many people, especially those who have spent years acting as emotional anchors for others, growth can involve learning something unfamiliar. Learning that care does not always mean constant availability. Learning that compassion does not require absorbing every emotional storm around you. Learning that understanding others does not mean abandoning your own psychological center. This realization can take time to settle, because many of us were taught that being a good friend meant always showing up in the same way, always listening, always supporting, always being the emotional foundation of the relationship. But individuation gently challenges that assumption. It asks a different question, not only how you care for others, but how you remain connected to yourself while doing so. And sometimes, the answer to that question changes the emotional structure of certain relationships, not through rejection, not through indifference, but through a gradual shift in how energy moves within the friendship. You may still care about the person, still wish them well, still respect the place they once held in your life, but the emotional role you once played is no longer the same. And learning to accept that change without blaming yourself is often one of the quiet lessons of psychological growth. Because growth rarely asks us to stop caring about people. It simply asks us to stop abandoning ourselves in order to maintain the same dynamics forever. Another reason this stage of growth can feel emotionally complicated is that the change is often misunderstood, both by others and by the person experiencing it. When someone begins to step back from emotional roles they once carried, it can sometimes appear, from the outside, as if they have become distant, less available, less reactive, less involved in the emotional intensity that once defined certain interactions. And because this shift is subtle, it can easily be misinterpreted. Friends who were accustomed to a certain dynamic may feel that something has changed, not necessarily in a dramatic way, but in small moments. Moments when you no longer respond to emotional situations with the same urgency. Moments when you listen, but do not immediately take responsibility for fixing what the other person feels. Moments when you choose calm observation instead of emotional immersion. For someone who spent years acting as the emotional center of a group, these changes can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because the old identity was built around being needed. Being the one who understood everything. Being the person who could absorb the emotional complexity of everyone around them. When that identity begins to loosen, a strange question can arise. If I am no longer the person who carries everyone else's emotions, who am I now? This is one of the deeper psychological transitions within individuation. The shift from being defined by emotional roles to being guided by inner alignment. And while this transition can create temporary uncertainty, it also opens the possibility for something healthier to emerge in relationships. Connections that are no longer based on emotional dependence, but on mutual presence, mutual respect, and the freedom for both people to remain psychologically centered within themselves. During this period, some people also experience a quiet sense of loneliness. Not because they no longer value connection, but because the emotional patterns that once created easy closeness are changing. You may find yourself between two psychological worlds, no longer fully at home in the old dynamics, but not yet surrounded by people who recognize the person you are becoming. This stage can feel uncertain, yet for many people, it is simply part of the transition between one version of life and the next. Over time, Many people discover that this shift does not eliminate meaningful relationships. Instead, it slowly filters them. Some connections fade naturally, others transform, and a few become deeper than they ever were before, because they are no longer sustained by emotional obligation, but by genuine understanding. When people first begin to notice these subtle changes in their friendships, it can feel unsettling, because we are often taught to think of relationships in very clear categories. A friendship is either strong, or it is failing. A connection either remains the same, or it is broken. But psychological growth rarely follows such simple lines. More often, it moves quietly through the inner landscape of a person's life, reshaping how they see themselves, reshaping what they need, and gradually reshaping how certain relationships fit into the life that is unfolding. Carl Jung believed that individuation was not about leaving the world behind. It was about becoming more fully yourself within it. And as that process unfolds, relationships inevitably change. Some friendships deepen, some transform into something new, and some remain connected to a chapter of life that has already played its role in shaping who you became. None of this erases the meaning those friendships once held. In fact, it often reveals how important they were. Because every relationship we experience participates in the story of our psychological development. Some friendships accompany us for decades. Others walk beside us for only a particular stage of the journey. But each one leaves something behind, a lesson, a memory, or a piece of emotional understanding that becomes part of who we are. And when we begin to see relationships through this lens, the quiet shifts we experience in friendship no longer feel like failures. They begin to look more like signs that life itself is moving forward, that the inner self Jung described is continuing to unfold, guiding us, slowly and sometimes silently, toward a life that feels more aligned with who we are becoming. If this reflection resonated with something you have been experiencing recently, you might also find it helpful to watch the video I shared just yesterday. In that video, we explore the subtle internal transformations that often appear after the Sophia Stage, the small psychological shifts that quietly begin to change how you see the world, yourself, and the people around you. It's called After the Sophia Stage, Small Shifts That Change Everything. And you may discover that many of the changes we discussed today are part of a much larger process of inner development. You'll find the link to that video right here.